At 14:37 on November 28, 1944, Lieutenant Hans Becker crouched in a waterlogged foxhole east of the Kahl River Trail in the Hürtgen Forest. His wire cutters hovered over the main communications line that ran through the mud to Major Klein's command post. 29 years old, a signals officer with the 116th Panzer Division, he had kept radios and wires working through 11 months of retreat from Normandy to the German border. Now his hands shook. The wire he was about to cut carried targeting data to 12 concealed MG-42 positions and 481mm mortar pits, all zeroed on the trail to the west. In 17 seconds, the time it took exhausted men to walk 80 meters, 13 American prisoners from the 28th Infantry Division would step into the kill zone. Becker knew their faces. 3 days trapped together in a bombed-out barn during an artillery barrage had given him their names. The Hürtgen Forest spread across steep ravines and dense fir along the German-Belgian border. The Americans called it the Death Factory. The Germans called it the Green Hell. The 116th Panzer Division, down to 40% strength after Aachen, held a thin defensive line in the eastern sector. Their orders were simple: delay the U.S. First Army's advance toward the Rhine for as long as possible. Every meter of forest bought time for Roer River defenses. Every American patrol that entered the trees was supposed to be destroyed. That morning, at 0500, Major Ernst Klein had briefed Becker in a dugout command post, 900 meters behind the line. A single kerosene lamp lit maps spread across a rough table. Klein, 44, a one-eyed veteran of the Eastern Front, spoke without looking up. Becker's job was clear: maintain all communication lines at all costs. No breaks. No failures. Klein described the kill zone, a 200-meter stretch where the forest thinned and fields of fire opened from both flanks. Machine gun crews had been dug in there for 6 days. Mortar crews had the range to the centimeter. Every approach was mined. Every escape route covered. When the forward observer called contact, every gun had to fire together. 3 seconds delay meant Americans might reach cover. 5 seconds meant they could flank the positions. Becker understood ambushes. He had been a signals officer since 1942, in France, in Russia, and now in this mud. He knew synchronized fires meant the difference between annihilation and escape. He also knew the penalty for failure. Under paragraph 91 of German military regulations, disobedience in combat meant court-martial and death by firing squad, especially now, with German soil under threat. He returned to his foxhole and checked his setup. He carried 2 radios, a FUG-5 short-range set for gun crews, and a FUG-16 long-range unit for division headquarters. At dawn, every crew had checked in. Ammunition loaded. Firing lanes cleared. Camouflage in place. Mortars ready since 0620. Forward observers confirmed their views at 0700. The primary wire ran directly to Klein's post. A secondary line looped north through a relay. Redundant, reliable, both tested for 6 days. Becker had not failed once. But 6 days ago, he had not known who would walk into the kill zone. At 1342, the forward observer reported movement on the western approach. An American column, size unknown, moving east along the Kahl Trail. Becker relayed the message. Klein ordered all crews to stand by and maintain radio silence until the signal to fire. At 14:15, the observer called again. 13 men, American uniforms, no heavy weapons, moving slowly. Not a combat patrol. Something else. Becker raised his Zeiss binoculars and studied the gaps between trees. Rain had faded to drizzle, but fog hugged the forest floor. He saw only dark shapes against gray-green trunks at first. The shapes shuffled like exhausted men, 500 meters away. For minutes to contact. 3.5 minutes to the center of the kill zone. He adjusted focus. The lead figure came into clarity. Tall, thin, coated in mud, helmet missing, rifle slung casually across his back. 12 men followed in similar condition. No proper formation, no scouts ahead. These were stragglers. Or prisoners. At 14:23, Becker recognized the lead man's face. Sergeant William Hayes, 28th Infantry Division, from Pittsburgh. 3 days earlier, during the failed American assault on Schmidt, Hayes and 20 others had been captured when German counterattacks cut off their companies. Becker knew this because he had been with the patrol that took them in a ruined barn south of the town. The capture had happened in a barn 400 meters south of Schmidt. Hayes's group had used it as a defensive position until German artillery brought the roof down, trapping them inside. Becker's signals unit had been moving through the area, repairing broken lines, when they stumbled on the ruins. A brief firefight followed. Americans fired from the shattered walls. Germans answered from the tree-line. After 20 minutes, both sides were pinned by their own guns. American artillery shelled German positions. German artillery shelled American positions. The barn lay between the barrages. Shells struck every 30 seconds. Shrapnel sliced through boards. Timbers crashed down. Men screamed on both sides. At some point the shooting simply stopped. Not from orders. Not from any plan. Firing at each other while both were being shelled had become pointless. A white undershirt rose on a stick from the barn. Lieutenant Werner, Becker's commander, ordered ceasefire. The Americans came out. 8 wounded. 13 unhurt. They sat in the mud while shells continued to fall around them. What followed was not mercy, only survival. Both groups needed to outlast the barrage. The Germans had medical supplies. The Americans had water. For 3 days, as artillery turned the surrounding forest into a moonscape, they sheltered together in the barn's last standing corner. They shared rations. They bandaged wounds. They spoke little, blocked by language, exhaustion, and the constant roar of shells. In that corner, they were not enemies. They were men waiting for the shelling to end. On the 3rd day, November 27th, an American counterattack broke through from the west. German positions around Schmidt collapsed. Werner's patrol had to retreat east. There was no time to march prisoners back, no time for processing. Werner made the choice many German officers made in those final months. He let them go. In broken English, he told Hayes to stay put, wait for his own men, and then the Germans withdrew into the forest. Becker never expected to see Hayes again. But now, at 14:27 the next day, Hayes walked straight toward the kill zone, 12 men behind him. Becker lowered his binoculars. His pulse pounded. He checked his equipment. Primary line intact. Secondary line intact. Fug 5 receiving clear signals from every gun crew. Everything worked. One word from him, contact, and Hayes would die. All 13 would die. The MG-42S would pour fire at 1,200 rounds a minute from 3 sides. Mortars would drop shells every 3 seconds. Becker had seen such ambushes. Bodies torn apart. Mud turned red. Screams that ended only when the mortars found them. He glanced at his watch. 14:29. The column was 350 meters away. 2 minutes to the kill zone. 120 seconds. His hand moved to the wire cutters on his belt. Standard Wehrmacht issue. He had used them hundreds of times. He knew exactly how much force it took to sever the 2mm copper line. 1 cut. 2 seconds. The primary line would die. Coordination would vanish. The ambush would fall apart. But this was not repair. It was sabotage. It was treason. And in combat, deliberate damage to vital equipment meant death. Becker knew that. He had seen a radio operator executed in Russia for falling asleep after 36 hours on duty. The sign over the man's body called him a traitor to his comrades. At 14:31, Hayes was 280 meters from the kill zone. 90 seconds. Becker weighed his choices. Obey orders, keep communications intact, call contact, and watch 13 men die. Or cut the wires, sabotage the ambush, and face certain execution. There was no third option. The numbers seemed simple. 13 lives versus 1. 13 men who had shared food with him in that barn. Men who had bandaged German wounds. Men already released once. Now unarmed, stumbling through fog toward a trap they could not see. But war never stayed simple. The 116th Panzer Division had orders to hold. Every American who survived would fight again. Germans would die as a result. The Fatherland was losing. Every delay, every ambush, every dead enemy bought time for defenses and evacuations. And cutting the wire might not even save them. Klein would send search parties. The cuts would be found quickly. Backup communications would be restored. The ambush might still go ahead, only later. Becker would die as a traitor, and the Americans could still be killed. At 14:32, Hayes closed to 220 meters. 60 seconds remained. Becker's hand tightened on the cutters as memories surfaced. Hayes in the barn, drinking from a German canteen, nodding in thanks. A young American private using his own dressing on a German corporal. Werner's quiet words. They were not butchers. The German term echoed in Becker's mind, Menschlichkeit, humanity, the belief that even in war, some lines could not be crossed. Prisoners were not to be executed. Unarmed men were not to be ambushed. But he also remembered division orders. No prisoners in retreat. No delays for mercy. Every soldier obeys. He remembered executed men left beside roads, fear keeping units in line. At 14:33, Hayes was 180 meters away. 40 seconds. Becker set the cutters on the primary communications wire. The line felt cold beneath the metal jaws. His hand stopped shaking. A strange clarity settled on him. This was not heroism, not bravery. It was the only decision he could live with, even if his life lasted only another hour. At 14:34, with Hayes 140 meters away, 20 seconds from the kill zone, Becker cut the wire. The sound was tiny, a soft click as copper parted. The effect was immediate. Static burst from the FUG-5. Gun crews called in, reporting lost signal. On the backup frequency, Klein demanded a status report. Becker ignored him. He dropped the cutters, grabbed his bayonet, and went for the secondary line, buried shallower. He drove the blade into the mud, felt for the cable, and slashed. Insulation tore. Copper frayed. The second line died. Now both radios filled with confusion. Gun crews could not coordinate. Mortar teams begged for updates. Klein shouted into his microphone, demanding answers. Becker rose halfway from the foxhole and looked toward the trail. Hayes was now 100 meters out, clear in the thinning fog. Becker raised both arms and cut one hand across the other, then pointed west into the trees. A universal signal. Danger, scatter, run. Hayes saw him. Their eyes met across the distance. Recognition flickered in Hayes's face. He turned and shouted to his men. They broke apart. 6 plunged left into thick underbrush. 7 dove right toward a ravine. 5 seconds later, the first MG-42 opened fire. The machine guns were firing blind. Without coordinated signals, each crew shot at guessed positions. Bullets shredded empty trail. Tracer rounds vanished into fog. Mortar shells fell, but without corrections they landed about 30 meters off. Trees exploded into splinters. Shrapnel shrieked through the air. 2 Americans went down briefly, hit by fragments in thigh and shoulder, but both got up and kept moving. Within 15 seconds, all 13 had vanished into the forest. Becker dropped back into his foxhole, shaking with adrenaline and fear. He had done it. He had cut both wires. He had saved them, at least for now. At 14:36, Klein's voice cut through the static, icy and controlled. All patrols were ordered to locate and repair the lines immediately. The signals officer was to report to the command post as soon as communications were restored. Becker understood what that meant. Fresh cuts on both lines would stand out. Too clean for shrapnel. Too deliberate for accident. His foxhole location was marked on maps. Investigators would trace the damage straight to him. By 14:42, he heard German voices in the trees. A patrol was sweeping the wire. He could run, but there was nowhere to go. Americans lay to the west, Germans to the east, and no man's land between. Mines, exposure, stray fire. Any direction meant almost certain death. He stayed in his foxhole and listened as boots slapped through mud and men followed the wire toward him. At 14:47, Unteroffizier Karl Hartmann appeared at the rim of the foxhole, holding a piece of severed wire. 35 years old, a veteran from the Polish campaign, Hartmann spoke flatly. The line had been cut. No anger, just fact. He climbed down with 3 soldiers, their weapons raised. Examining the bright copper end, he noted the clean cutter marks. He asked Becker where his cutters were. Becker pointed to them lying in the mud. Hartmann compared tool and wire. The match was obvious. "Did you cut this wire?" he asked. Becker could have lied. He could have blamed an American raid, claimed an attack, invented saboteurs. But no enemy patrol had been reported. No one could have slipped so deep through German lines unseen. The timing fit too perfectly with the ambush. "Yes," Becker said. Hartmann did not look shocked, only tired. He asked why. Becker answered that they were prisoners, unarmed, and he knew them. Hartmann repeated the words slowly. Then he raised his MP-40. He reminded Becker of paragraph 91, disobedience in combat, sabotage of operations, death penalty. Becker agreed quietly. Hartmann's finger touched the trigger, then paused. Executing a fellow officer in a muddy foxhole felt different from a formal courtyard shooting. Hartmann had seen enough death. He argued instead. Those 13 Americans would kill Germans. Prisoners were executed every day now, by the SS, by divisions without food or guards. This was how the war ended. Becker repeated his answer. They were prisoners, released once already. Walking into an ambush was not combat. It was execution. Hartmann finally lowered the gun and turned to his men. Becker would go to the command post. Major Klein would decide. They pulled Becker from the foxhole and did not bother to bind him. There was nowhere to run. He counted each step through the trees. 847 steps and 11 minutes to the dugout. At 15:09, they reached the command post. Klein stood in the rain outside the dugout, expressionless. He looked at Becker and stated the fact. The wires had been cut. Becker answered yes. Klein asked why. Becker explained. The Americans were prisoners he had guarded, released 3 days earlier by Lieutenant Werner. Unarmed, walking into an ambush that was not a battle, but murder. Klein held his gaze for several seconds, then spoke. Murder, he said, was not the point. Germany was losing. The Allies were 30 kilometers from the Rhine. Once they crossed it, they would march to Berlin. Every day of delay mattered. Every American killed here was one less at the Rhine. He did not care if they were prisoners or unarmed. They were the enemy, and Becker had let them go. Klein outlined the regulations. Under normal conditions, he would file a report. Division would hold a court-martial. Becker would be found guilty, shot, and displayed as a warning. That was the proper procedure. But time was short. The sector was under pressure. He needed every man at his post. So he offered Becker a choice. Return to his foxhole, restore the lines, continue his duty, and they would pretend this never happened. Or refuse, and Klein would shoot him immediately. Becker knew it was a lie. The report would come later. The court-martial would still happen. But the offer gave the illusion of escape. Becker shook his head. He could not go back. He could not sit at those radios and call in the next ambush. He could not continue this work. Klein's expression did not change. He nodded once, then drew his Walther P-38 pistol. Standard Wehrmacht issue, 9mm, 8-round magazine. He had carried it since 1941 and had used it once before to execute a deserter near Stalingrad. He called Hartmann forward as witness. 2 more soldiers joined them, meeting the regulation requirement for field executions. They stood at attention in the rain. Klein raised the pistol. Becker did not close his eyes. He looked at Klein, then at the forest behind him. He pictured Hayes running west through the trees. He pictured the 13 Americans alive because he had cut a wire. He thought of his family in Stuttgart, mother, sister, young nephew, who would receive notice that he had died in combat, never knowing the truth. Perhaps that was Kinder. At 15:21, Klein fired 3 shots. The first struck Becker's chest. The second hit near his collarbone. The third tore through his throat. Becker fell backward into the mud. He did not die instantly. For 37 seconds he lay drowning in his own blood, while Klein holstered the pistol and turned away. Hartmann and the others dragged the body to the main trail, the same trail where the Americans would have died. They left him face up, arms spread. Klein ordered a sign to be placed over him. Traitor, death to all who betray the fatherland. The corpse lay there for 4 days. German patrols passed without stopping. American patrols reached the sector on December 2nd. A U.S. Army medic, Thomas Cross, examined the body. His report noted a German lieutenant with multiple close-range gunshot wounds, likely shot by his own side. Routine internal discipline, nothing more. 13 days later, on December 15th, Sergeant William Hayes died under German artillery near Merode, 12 kilometers north of where Becker fell. Hayes never knew the German officer who had warned him off the trail was executed for saving him. The other 12 Americans survived the war. None of them learned Becker's fate. History recorded the incident in numbers and brief notes. An ambush that failed. An officer disciplined. Casualties added to statistics. But the moral question endures. Under Wehrmacht law, Becker committed treason. He sabotaged an operation, allowed enemies to escape, and broke his oath. Any wartime army, German, American, British, Soviet, might have judged him a criminal. Armies enforce obedience with the threat of bullets. Yet under any code that honors human dignity, his choice was the only ethical one. 13 unarmed prisoners walking into a hidden crossfire is not battle. It is slaughter. The Geneva Conventions, which Germany had signed, forbade killing prisoners of war, even as its forces violated them. Becker, alone in a foxhole, upheld a principle his own army had abandoned. The Wehrmacht executed around 15,000 of its own soldiers for desertion, cowardice, or disobedience. Many died for less than Becker did, for doubt, for failing to hold impossible ground, for sheer exhaustion. Military justice in 1944 ran on fear. It worked. Men obeyed because they feared their officers more than the enemy. Becker broke that chain of fear for 17 seconds, the time Hayes needed to cross 80 meters into safety. He did not act for glory. He did not expect to live. He acted because watching those men die would have destroyed what remained of his soul. And so the question turns to us. In his place, knowing the cost, knowing your death would not change the war or save your country, only spare 13 men from an unseen execution, would you have cut the wire?